I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we assess the overall strategic picture as Russia sets its sights on one of the regions not illegally annexed, after one of the most furious but failed aerial bombardments of the war. Then we hear more from the fallout of German Chancellor Merz's meeting with Trump and from the Polish presidential election last week, before hearing from a historian of the Cold War about the right and wrong lessons we take from that era.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 9th of June, 3 years and 106 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's senior foreign correspondent, Memphis Barker, live from Ukraine, and Berlin correspondent James Rothwell, dialing in from Germany. Later, you'll hear from historian Vladislav Zubok. But first, a summary from me of the key military and political developments from the weekend and this morning. In what's being hailed as a heroic night for Ukraine's air defences, Russian forces launched one of the most extensive aerial assaults of the war. More than 479 drones and 20 missiles fired across almost the entire country. Yet the vast majority were thwarted. According to Ukrainian authorities, 277 drones were shot down and a further 183 jammed by electronic warfare or simply vanished from radar. Among the intercepted missiles were 10 Kh-101 cruise missiles, 4 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, 2 anti-radiation missiles, and 1 Kh-35 cruise missile. 2 Kh-22 cruise missiles also dropped off radar. Those numbers would mean that, if accurate, Ukrainian defence forces intercepted 479 out of 499 enemy air threats. We've become somewhat accustomed to these successes, but it is worth taking a moment just to reflect on what a remarkable achievement that is and how dire the consequences would have been had those weapons hit their target. As it was, despite that extraordinary defensive effort, 10 locations were reportedly struck and debris fell in 17. Some of the worst hit locations appear to be in the Rivne region in western Ukraine, between Kyiv and Lviv. It was heavily attacked last night and then by missiles and drones a few hours ago. In Zaporizhia, authorities claim Russian forces dropped guided bombs on residential areas, with 2 people injured and at least 7 private houses destroyed and dozens more damaged. A gas pipeline was also hit. President Zilinski, in one of several interviews he gave over the weekend, confirmed the reports we cited on Friday that Washington has diverted 20,000 anti-drone missiles originally intended for Ukraine to American forces in the Middle East, something which will have quite big ramifications potentially given the attacks I've just described. There is speculation that that move took place due to the vulnerabilities to drones exposed by Operation Spider's Web, but more on that later. Zelensky also urged the US to allow Ukraine to purchase air defence systems again, something Trump seems reluctant to allow, as we've discussed before, despite it being very different from the Biden administration's approach, which donated the weapons, of course. To quote Zelensky, "We are working to strengthen Ukraine's air defence. We urgently need positive signals from the US regarding air defence systems. We are still waiting for a response to our request to purchase systems that can help." He then added it is essential for the whole of Europe to jointly produce air defence systems and missiles. Zelensky also rebutted Trump's remarks which compared Russia and Ukraine to kids. "We are not kids with Putin at the playground in the park. Putin is a murderer," he said, "who came to this park to kill the kids." Now, there's also been a cascade of Ukrainian long-range strikes on military targets in the past 48 hours, with reports that 2 Russian fighter jets were hit at the Savoslayka airbase in Nizhny Novgorod, as well as the Shahed component factory in Cheboksary. 2 Ukrainian UAVs can be seen directly impacting that plant in footage released this morning, setting it on fire. Witnesses also say that a stockpile of solvent chemicals is burning not too far from the Kazan gunpowder factory, and that the Azot chemical plant in Tula region is also ablaze. The Hydromash factory in Melitopol in occupied Zaporizhia was also struck. Now, I should stress that the above reports are not comprehensive, given the scale of the bombardments overnight and over the weekend. We are still assembling a picture of what took place and the implications. So let's turn to the ground war next, as we're still digesting that. We have official confirmation that Russian forces are attempting to push into a new Ukrainian region, which Moscow claimed on Sunday was its core target. The Kremlin's defense ministry said troops from a tank unit had reached the western border of Donetsk and are continuing to develop an offensive in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Now, just for context, Dnipropetrovsk is one of those regions Russia has not illegally annexed, which some are saying is yet more evidence that Moscow has no intention of stopping, even in the event they were to ever fully take those regions that they have claimed as their own. Now, Deep State Map, a Ukrainian open-source intelligence map monitoring the front line, suggested Russian troops were around 100 metres from the border near the town of Horokove. Ukraine's Southern Defence Forces appeared to confirm yesterday afternoon that Russian troops were trying to enter the region but had not yet broken through. As one spokesman for the Ukrainian military said, "Our soldiers are courageously and professionally holding their section of the front, disrupting the occupiers' plans. This work does not stop for a minute." Now, there are concerns in the Ukrainian military, as the Telegraph reported over the weekend, that Russia could advance fairly quickly in Dnipropetrovsk because it's a largely flat region, given that there are fewer natural obstacles or villages that could be used as defensive positions by Kyiv. But others are more sceptical, and you'll hear a range of voices on that question in an overall summary of the strategic picture I'll cite in a moment. Now, Russian forces also appeared to have captured a village called Nochnia in Ukraine's northern region of Sumy, about 30 kilometres north of Sumy city, the site of what some are calling the core sector of focus for Russia's summer offensive. In total, Moscow's troops seized 196 square miles of Ukrainian territory last month, up from 146 miles in April and 93 in March. The gains were concentrated in the eastern Donetsk region, as we've been reporting. But as we've talked about many times, territory seized is not always the best measure of where we are in terms of the broader military picture. But nonetheless, those figures, I think, were worth citing. In other developments, Kyiv has released a new footage of its daring raid last week that struck 4 Russian airfields. The clip shows a first-person view drone taking off from a mobile wooden cabin and flying across fields before landing on a Russian Tu-22M3 strategic bomber in Belaya, Siberia, passing a previously hit plane engulfed in flames. It is, again, remarkable footage, with the Ukrainians seeking to use this operation as evidence that with more Allied support, it would be possible to cripple the Russian war machine and impose a ceasefire. To quote Zilinski in an interview with ABC News yesterday, "Frankly speaking, we are very close to the moment when Russia can be forced to end the war, or at least to stop. We feel it. Our Operation Spider's Web, even though the Russians were furious, they understand that we'll rely on our own strength. We don't want the war to continue, but we'll fight for ourselves if that is the only way out. We're very close. We need strong support from the United States. The US needs unity with Europe and still needs to put pressure on Putin. He doesn't want to end the war, but he can end the war under pressure from partners. In my opinion, that gives us a chance. And this doesn't sound pessimistic at all. I'm talking about reality." Now, since we're on the subject of Operation Spider's Web, thank you to all of those who continue to write in offering comparable historical operations. The most popular one over the weekend is the Battle of Taranto in 1940, when Britain's Royal Navy launched the first all-aircraft ship-to-ship naval attack in history, striking the battle fleet of the Italian Navy at anchor in the harbour of Taranto using aerial torpedoes. This strike marked a turning point, signalling that air power was set to eclipse the dominance of traditional battleships. As some of you have pointed out, it was one of the operations that inspired Pearl Harbor and was arguably much more successful than that operation. But to end, I want to quote from a new piece published by our friends at The Economist, which looks ahead to Putin's summer offensive. It provides an excellent summary of where we are at the present moment, I think. They write, and I quote, "After weeks of nebulous ceasefire talks at the urging of a semi-engaged President Donald Trump, the war between Russia and Ukraine is intensifying again in savage style and with escalating strikes. In the last 2 weeks, there have been record-breaking Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian cities and spectacular Ukrainian drone raids on Russia's strategic bomber force deep inside its borders. But all this is merely a prelude to the main event, a large-scale summer offensive by Russia that aims to break Ukrainian morale and deliver President Vladimir Putin a symbolic victory at almost any cost. Many Ukrainian cities and soldiers are bracing for a final reckoning. Ukrainian intelligence believe that Konstantinivka and neighbouring Pokrovsk will be the centre of Russia's campaign. There are concerns about the northeastern province of Sumy, too. For the first time since the war began, Russia is gaining nearly as much ground there in the north as it is in the main Donbass theatre, largely because it is making light work of fortifications unsuited to drone warfare. Military sources say they would still expect that once Russia establishes a buffer zone, it will shift focus to the Donbass and Zaporizhia fronts to the south, continuing the attritional warfare that has turned that region into a pockmarked wasteland. The front lines have not shifted in Russia's favour in any strategically significant way for 3 years. But Ukrainian sources claim that captured Russian officers tell them the summer campaign is being presented as one last push to break Ukraine's morale. Some Ukrainians are sceptical that Russia can ever break through. The nature of the fighting, in small dismounted groups to mitigate the risk from drones, means that Russian progress is never quick and losses are high. The invader has still not been able to demonstrate that it can break through defences and then exploit the gap by making rapid or significant advances. But other soldiers are more cautious. A key part of Ukraine's resilience has been its early edge in drone warfare. But that advantage is now eroding. Eduard, an officer in the 93rd Brigade, says Russia has even pulled ahead in what he calls the frontline drone marathon. A new Russian unit called Rubicon is causing particular trouble around the Konstantinivka-Pokrovsk sections, chopping up Ukrainian supply lines up to 40 kilometres to the rear. Rubicon reports directly to the Ministry of Defence and is seen as well-resourced and tightly organised. 3 years and 4 months into the full-scale war, Ukraine still believes it will avoid a collapse of its front lines. Yet between collapse and the front remaining stable, plenty of suboptimal outcomes are possible. The probable result of Russia's summer offensive remains uncomfortable. No clear victory or defeat, but with Putin able to point to some shift on the map that may be enough to encourage him to keep fighting. So a stark assessment from The Economist there, which we'll of course link to in the show notes. But let's stay in the military theatre now and hear from the Telegraph's senior foreign correspondent Memphis Barker, who's dialing in from Ukraine and can talk to some of these themes. Memphis, welcome. You've just written a dispatch which draws attention to Russia's renewed aerial campaign on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, a target that had apparently been deprioritised after the Trump-Putin calls back in March, but which has since faced renewed attacks in recent weeks with no apparent hesitation. You were in Mykolaiv. What did you see there, and what did you learn?
Hi, Francis. Thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, no, it was a really interesting trip to the Mykolaiv combined heat and power plant. Essentially, it's been hit 4 times in the last 4 months, and you can see the wreckage. The boiler room is completely destroyed. The turbine control panel sensor's been hit with the Shahed. It means you can no longer produce electricity. You've got workers trying to fix what they can, but a lot of it it is in such a dire state of repair that it will take years to get back up and running. And the workers who I met, they're a very inspiring bunch. They've been working under the threat of bombardment for months now. Since March 18th, there was a kind of a lull in the attacks on Ukrainian energy facilities. They were hit one more time in May, but it appeared that Trump and Putin had come to some kind of partial ceasefire that would see certainly lesser missiles, lesser drone strikes on the electricity power stations, the heating power stations that really Ukraine relies upon. The one thing that I was really struck by is they just ploughed on. These people came to work even in November, right after the first Iskander strike. They came to work the next day. They had 2 weeks basically to get the plant up and running for heating season, which is when citizens in Mykolaiv can turn on their radiators when it sinks below freezing. And they've managed in that time to take pipelines that had been destroyed by the Iskander strike from 2 ruined boilers and move them across to a much older 1930s boiler that they'd managed to get up and running. And they're doing this as air raid alarms are going off constantly. They're doing this quite rightly fearful of further strikes. And I spoke to the plant chairman. He said the moment we got the heating back up and running, it wasn't like there was some great celebration. They basically thought we have to prepare for the next round of strikes. And within months, they were hit 3 more times. So it shows you the kind of grit and determination it takes just to keep basic services running across much of Ukraine.
Thanks, Memphis. Now, of course, the success that Ukraine has had with relation to defending its energy infrastructure is extraordinary, given the fears that there were in the months leading up to this phase of the war and the winter period particularly. I wonder, when you were speaking to people there, did they talk about this as being a great success, or were they just focused in a sense on their part, or do they see themselves as part of a broader strategic battle that has been fought in Ukraine of keeping the lights on, literally as well as metaphorically?
There was huge pride. Several workers, they weren't banging on about it, but you could see in the way they spoke that they were feeling part of a kind of national effort, and that the city, which you could see just in the background of the plant, it was their work that had kept the heat on as temperatures hit minus 3-4 degrees. So there was a sense that they'd been part of a national effort to avoid disaster. They had some forms of kind of advantage in the sense that the winter wasn't as cold as it could have been, and there was less general use of electricity from industrial consumers. But the staff there, it seems to me they felt that they were working as a group, and there was a lot of praise for the plant manager being very much visible, leading from the front, staying in the plant, even as these missiles and these drones kept hitting. He described the moment to me when the Iskander hit, not far from his office. There's clouds of smoke everywhere. There's a fire because a gas pipeline's been hit. He's running through the plant, trying to check if people are injured, where they're injured, what they're going to do. Suddenly you've got floods of emergency services running in, and then another Iskander hits almost immediately afterwards. And this guy didn't take for the hills. He's, like all of them, back at work the next day, doing 16-hour shifts. There was one staff member who pointed to the cranes in the shipyard next door. And that shipyard was the one that built the Admiral Kuznetsov, Russia's only aircraft carrier. And he said, well, we think of ourselves like those cranes, those 910-ton cranes. We're a huge part of the infrastructure, the prongs of support that keep this country running. So rather than looking at those cranes as something that built an enemy vessel, they were saying, well, like them, we're a foundational part of this nation.
Well, thanks, Memphis. It's a really, really interesting dispatch on this element of the war, and so we'll, of course, link to it in the show notes. Before you go, because I know it's a busy day for you, Memphis, it always is when one's on the road reporting in Ukraine. What else are you looking into in your time there in the country?
Well, some of the things you mentioned in that fantastic Economist piece is we're trying to get a bit closer to the way that drones are changing the front line. And I know we'll have all heard that 100 times before, and we've been reporting on drones as an element of the war since 2022. I think there does seem to be a real serious evolution of that story at this point. We've just been at a drone workshop. You talk to soldiers there, and they do say that the front lines themselves are now much more heavily patrolled by drones, and meaning that infantry are able to withdraw slightly further back. And these weapons, which we know are now causing, 70%, 80% of casualties, 70% of knocking out armored vehicles, that really they are the war at the front at the moment. And so trying to just tell the evolution of that story and get close to the people making the drones, doing the training, also edge our way towards it over the next couple of days. That's one of the things we'll be looking at. Another story we're wangling our way towards is, from Kyiv at least, where we are now, is how the army is treating soldiers who've gone AWOL. And there are a fair number, as you can imagine, with the pressures on the front. Ukraine's reputedly relatively kind to these people, understands that conscription is, for many, an absolutely terrifying event, and the front is as extreme as we've all seen in the reports and videos over the years. But what they're trying to do now is essentially, in some of these units, is trying to softly bring these guys back to the front, because actually it's quite hard to live as an AWOL soldier. You can't access many services, you have to hide out in the shadows. And so this unit, which his recruitment center will be going to, is going to try and tell us about how it deals with these kind of soldiers.
Well, thanks very much, Memphis, and we look forward to having you back on the podcast to update us on those stories. Let's go from Ukraine to Germany now, bringing in our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell. James, welcome back. Last week you were paying close attention to that nail-biting Polish election, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But first, we were reporting on Friday's podcast that encounter between Chancellor Friedrich Merz and President Trump in the White House. Just interested, how was that received in Germany? There's some quite interesting exchanges that took place.
Yes, that's right, Francis. On the whole, it's been well received in Germany, but it's got to be said that the bar for success in these meetings is relatively low. If you manage to come out of the Oval Office after a meeting with Donald Trump without a black eye, figuratively speaking, or even literally speaking, perhaps, that means you've done a good job based on the experiences of some leaders, like Mr. Zilinski himself, and also the leader of South Africa. Others have fared better, it is true, like our own Sir Keir Starmer. But the German press on the whole thinks it was a success. I'm just going to take you through some of the reaction from the German media, because I think it's quite revealing. Spiegel magazine had a headline, "Friedrich Merz is not Angela Merkel," in a piece that was welcoming that meeting and said that on the whole it went pretty well. And the theory behind this piece is that the reason that Mr. Merz endeared himself somewhat to Mr. Trump is that he's a bit of a right-wing populist. Yes, he's from Angela Merkel's party, which famously opened the borders of Germany in 2015, a decision that Donald Trump has constantly criticized. Merz has always tried to position himself from being about as far away from Angela Merkel within the party as you could possibly get. He's anti-mass migration. He's got a bit of a populist streak to him as well. It's not beneath him to use migration almost as a political football in campaigning, which he certainly did during the last election with great success. And so Spiegel magazine felt that Mr. Merz managed to pull this off because before the meeting actually took place, it was very clear to Mr. Trump that Friedrich Merz is not Angela Merkel too, even though he's from the same party, the CDU. Now, another quite interesting article, which was published also in Der Spiegel, but with a much less positive spin on the event, was by a Spiegel journalist called Stefan Kuzmani. And he said, Friedrich Merz's greatest stroke of luck was that no one in the White House was really interested in him, Germany, or Europe. And of course, he's referring to the fact that on the same day as this meeting, there was this absolutely massive, historic blow up in relations between Elon Musk and Mr. Trump, which around the same time at least overshadowed what was going on. So that was a slightly more kind of negative take on how the meeting went. The Freie Press said that the meeting did at least have a serious slant, referring to some of the more kind of detailed discussions they got into on the future of the relationship. But that newspaper complained that Friedrich Merz at times, quote, seemed completely lost sitting next to the US president, perhaps being a little bit harsh there. But overall, I think the broad picture of the German press reaction and the reaction in general is that Merz held his own. He came across as reasonably assertive. He obviously brought a nice flattering gift to Donald Trump in the form of that birth certificate from one of his ancestors. And so even though expectations were quite low, I mean, they just wanted to get through this meeting without having a bust-up, particularly a bust-up over the far-right AfD, a party that the Trump administration has repeatedly endorsed over the CDU. That was a big source of anxiety, certainly, for the Germans going into this meeting. I think that they basically managed to pull it off. And this is a positive development on the whole, I think, because German-American relationships under the Trump administration, to be completely frank, have not been very good. It's a kind of open secret that the Trump administration would have much preferred it if the AfD had won this election and not Friedrich Merz. That's why Elon Musk, when he was part of the outfit at least, was campaigning so aggressively for the AfD during the election campaign back in February. That's why J.D. Vance held a meeting with the leader of the AfD, a personal meeting when he went to Munich Security Conference. And yet they had a sit down in the Oval Office. They got on relatively well. Rothwell, and of course for Mr. Merz in particular, this is very important to him because he wants to put himself out there on the world stage as a much bolder and stronger leader of Europe than his predecessor Olaf Scholz was, and I think it's fair to say that he met that goal.
Well, danke, Herr Merz. Well done for getting through that. Let's turn to Poland then, James. And of course, that election result has potentially some significant ramifications. And I note that the president-elect this morning said this: "I'm against Ukraine's entry into the European Union. Ukraine must understand that countries like Poland and Hungary and other European countries also have their own interests." Now, that's not a great surprise given what he was saying during the campaign, but just how serious do you think this is, James? And what are the ramifications of the election result that we've seen in the last few days?
So in terms of the impact of this election on military support for Ukraine, which is obviously a very important sort of theme for this podcast, I'm not convinced that it's going to affect the bottom line. I think something slightly more subtle is going on in Polish politics at the moment. There's cross-party support and there's widespread consensus in Poland for defending Ukraine against Russia. And that's largely due to Poland's own national interests. It shares a very long border with Ukraine. It has first-hand experience of the war when all the Ukrainian refugees came over that border at the start of that full-scale invasion. And this is where we get into the new comments that you've quoted from Karol Nawrocki, the president-elect in Poland. The right in Poland would like to have a more transactional relationship with Ukraine than Donald Tusk does. And that's why, for example, Nawrocki is making no bones about making his view clear that he doesn't want to see Ukraine in the European Union. That's largely being driven by what he perceives as the national interest of Poland. He's got a big concern, for example, about, as he sees it, Ukrainian farmers already undercutting Polish farmers as a result of trade restrictions being lifted since the full-scale invasion. And that's something that he has no issues of putting that out there front and centre in terms of his political identity, that he's anti-EU membership for Ukraine and that he wants to be seen to be standing up for Poles primarily and supporting the national interest. It's not the kind of rhetoric that you see really from Donald Tusk, who I think it's fair to say tries to steer clear as much as possible of using the Ukraine issue in any way to make domestic political gains. The other thing I'd say about Nawrocki is that he's a historian. That's his background. His shtick really is that he likes to take controversial moments from history and kind of breathe new life into them and almost try to fight culture wars over them. And we've seen a little bit of that already in the election campaign, this row over, for example, alleged genocides committed many decades ago by Ukrainians against Poles, which the Polish right is now in the middle of a sort of existential war against Ukraine, has decided to bring this stuff up again, as I said, in order to fight almost a kind of historical culture war in Poland, which is all really about domestic political gain. It all looks a little bit odd when viewed from a distance. We see Poland, this country that is absolutely one of the biggest defenders of Ukraine in Europe, and I'm not really seeing any signs of that fundamentally changing in the near future. But at the same time, we're seeing this new right-wing president, who, by the way, will have the power to veto legislation in Poland, showing a willingness to, as I said earlier, introduce into the rhetoric a slightly more transactional approach to Poland's relationship with Ukraine. And he's not afraid of, or he's not reluctant to use Ukraine as a bit of a political football. And so I think what we're going to see going forward is that kind of shift in tone at the top of the Polish system in the presidency. And it's worth stressing again, the role of presidency in Poland is largely ceremonial, but it is, of course, the figurehead of Poland, and the president does have power to veto legislation. And just finally on that point about vetoing legislation, and this is where things could get very, very rocky for Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister. When Mr. Tusk was elected, he was elected on a platform of liberal reform. He wanted to liberalise the abortion laws in Poland, which are some of the toughest in Europe. He wanted to introduce reforms on civil partnerships. That was a big part of him getting elected back then. And if he's got a right-wing law and justice president in the form of Karol Nawrocki sitting over him, willing to veto that legislation, it's going to be really, really hard for Tusk to get those domestic key reforms through. And that is why there's been some speculation about the potential collapse of the government. And indeed, we've got later this week on Wednesday a vote of confidence in the Polish government called by Donald Tusk himself in order to reassure Poles that he's still got control of the country and of the legislative process. The narrative on elections in Europe over the past couple of months has been a narrative that says if you're the Trumpy candidate in an election, that doesn't get you elected. So, for example, in Germany, the Trump administration endorsed the AfD. They didn't win. We saw slightly similar dynamics going on with Trumpy populist right-wing candidates in Romania and in Portugal. But then Poland has broken that trend, right? In the Polish presidential elections, we saw a guy who was explicitly endorsed by the Trump administration in Karol Nawrocki get a surprise victory. And it was a surprise victory that Nawrocki won this. Tusk, of course, is the prime minister. His civic platform, centrist party, was expected by many, actually, to take control of the presidency as well and clear the pathway towards having full reign to pass those reforms. So it could be argued that, if we could go as far as saying this, the anti-Trump wave in European politics might potentially be coming to an end as heralded by the results of Poland. And we'll just have to see, I guess, whether that is reflected in any other significant elections that may come in the rest of 2025.
That's very interesting. Thanks, James. And yeah, I think another way perhaps of looking at it is this trend that basically any election that happens is always bad for the incumbents. And if you're on the right, then that's good for you. And if you're on the left, then that's good for you. But that actually is the determinant factor of the most likely trajectory of many, many of the elections that we've seen in the last year or so, including, of course, the election of Mr. Trump. It's a bad time to be an incumbent. People are not happy about the state of the economies as well, and immigration and all sorts of manner of subjects. Vladislav Zubok is Professor of International History at the London School of Economics and a head of the Cold War Studies programme in its Department of International History. He is the author of a new book on the post-war period called The World of the Cold War, 1945 to 1991. It challenges the popular narrative that economic superiority and democratic values led the US to victory. Instead, it places the war in the context of global decolonisation, Soviet weakness, and the accidents of history, using that perspective to inform the miscalculations made by both East and West in this war. This is our conversation. Now, I want to start, if I may, by asking you just to summarise how you've broken up this book, because you've done it according to ancient gods. It's quite an interesting way of thinking about what was an extended period in European history.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I want to comment on what I've just been listening. This is a torrent of news, and it kind of reminded me of how real history happens. So all of us, for instance, now in 1948, and someone on television tells us about the crisis in Czechoslovakia, the Berlin blockade and all that, and it's endless torrent. It's the open faucet of water flooding us. And it's essential at some point to say, enough, I want to raise my head above the surface. And this is why we should read books about history. So this is why I wrote my book during the war in Ukraine, listening to this, trying to take an eagle view on what amazing decades of conflict we lived through and survived. Roman gods are simple. I had a hope to become a Roman historian many moons ago. But also the choice of Roman gods, I think, highlights the changes during all those 4 decades of the Cold War. Zeitgeist, as our German friends used to call the spirit of the times, zeitgeist changed repeatedly. So, for instance, the first part is immediately after 45, is called after the god of Mars, the god of war. And for that period, it was absolutely natural for everyone who lived through 2 world wars to think, hey, a third world war is absolutely inevitable, maybe, and possible at least. So that's the zeitgeist of the time, at least until 1953. In 1953, conveniently, Joseph Stalin dies, and the period of more hopes for détente emerges. But still, people believe in one way of deterrence. One way of deterrence is, of course, nuclear weapons. And those nuclear weapons end up destroying humanity many times over. So it's a very strange period that I call after the god of Vulcan, the god that keeps making arms. So by arms race, humanity at the time, at least the leading powers, expected to avert a major calamity, a war, a third world war, but they only created the possibility of destroying all humanity at once. So that's paradox which ended up in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the worst crisis we ever faced, led to the third period that I named after the god Janus, who had apparently two phases, one turning to war and one turning to peace. This is a time for détente, this is a time of containment, but also attempts to cooperate. And ultimately, the Cold War ends, of course, with Reagan and then Gorbachev coming to power. And I called it the time of Minerva. According to philosophers, Minerva is a goddess with an owl, and owl is the symbol of wisdom. So finally, there was enormous fatigue during that time about another confrontation. There was enormous movement to ban nuclear weapons, particularly in Britain, but also no one knew how to end the conflict. And this is a key conclusion. No one knew how the conflict would end. So the likely scenario was maybe a war, maybe a violent Soviet collapse, maybe a revolution and collapse of the Soviet regime. So ultimately, nobody expected Gorbachev. So the owl of Minerva proved to be wiser than all of us together, I would say. And I finished the book with another god, Mercury, god of commerce, god of deals, god of trade. And as I was writing the book, it was before Trump's second coming. And I thought, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe all these wars going on in the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, maybe I'm wrong. But then Trump came and began to talk about deals and cutting deals. So I think I'm validated in part in my choice of the last god for this book.
Another aspect of your book, and I was reading it yesterday, is its global perspective. There's a tendency to focus very strongly in the European theatre in relation to the Cold War for obvious reasons, but you've tried to expand that out into including much more of the globe. Can you speak to why you thought that was important?
Well, first of all, it reflects the very dynamics of the conflict. It started in Europe and over Europe, above all, because Europe was prostrate, divided by the victorious armies. Germany, the pivotal country of Europe, was defeated and divided by the victorious armies. And the major question then was, who would control Europe? And of course, we know the answer. It ended up in dividing Europe and the West, particularly the US, taking the most developed, potentially more powerful part of Europe and helped to reconstruct it. But that is a source of conflict, and every conflict has a tendency to spread and metastasize. So during that first period, Eurocentric period of the Cold War, I would say the conflict spread in this way, from center to the periphery. And the victory of communism in China, for instance, happened, right, in 1949. And that was a major jolt. And then the Korean War started in a place where no one thought a war would start. And everybody said, oh, well, it's Asia that is important. So this is a point of reversal when the conflict that we call Cold War began to change its character, going from the center to the peripheries like Asia to becoming centripetal, like all these conflicts in faraway countries that few people actually knew much about. First Korea, then Indochina, Vietnam, then, Africa, Angola, Mozambique, and so on and so forth. And finally, Afghanistan, the place where no one expected any conflict. They began to reignite the conflict in the center. So it's centripetal, right? If I'm correct in my sort of elementary physics. So all these impulses for the conflict come from outside inside. It's more like implosion effect. And this is how the conflict developed to the very end. Only at the very end, Gorbachev was pulling troops from Afghanistan, pulling troops later on from Mongolia. And all of a sudden, in the center of the conflict in Eastern Europe, anti-communist revolutions were victorious because of the reason nobody expected. Because Gorbachev was ending the conflict and coming up with a totally different, inclusive, unifying image for the humanity. So I'm very big on Gorbachev at the end of my book. And I think without Gorbachev, we would have been fed almost inevitably and endlessly by those local conflicts that never ended and ended up like pulling the main superpowers again and again and again ran into this endless vortex of a mutual confrontation.
Do you think that Gorbachev is the man who is responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union? I remember reading Tony Jutt's book, which I've cited on this podcast many times, and he gives particular emphasis to this idea of really it was only the collapse in the centre of Russia itself, the attempt to reform, which was the main event that really meant that things went in the direction that they did, rather than it being all of this idea of American pressure and the Star Wars program. I mean, what's your perspective on why the Soviet Union fell?
Well, Tony Judd was a great thinker. He didn't have access to much of the ex-Soviet archives and Eastern European archives, but actually he's very much on the point, as sometimes great thinkers are. And I went through all available evidence and published a humongous book called Collapse, The Fall of the Soviet Union, a few years ago. And there is the same conclusion. It was implosion of the empire from within, when suddenly such figures as Boris Yeltsin, many still may remember him, came up with this image of a new resurgent Russia, proud and anti-communist and capitalist and pro-market. And that was so sudden and the scenario that no one expected, that people, of course, gave more weight to such factors as structural reasons for Soviet crisis, economic, otherwise, to the Cold War burdens and commitments of the Soviet Union. That's true. And many people in America still believe that Reagan crushed the Soviet power. But what I found is absolutely the same as Tony Judd had written many, many years ago, without the sufficient evidence. It was just his intuition. And I found the evidence that proved his intuition was right. But my answer, why I mentioned Gorbachev is so big in my narrative, he allowed, with his reforms, the glasnost and liberalization, and his, I would say, amazingly philosophical view of power and society, quite unusual for the general secretary of the Communist Party, he allowed the forces and actors such as Yeltsin to rise peacefully, and then challenged him. And when they challenged him, and when he felt cornered by that sort of resurgent Russia camp, he didn't fight back. He didn't use force. He could have easily sent Yeltsin early on in 1989 even to a distant, let's say, African country as an ambassador. But every time his lieutenants turned to him and pointed to the danger of Yeltsin challenging the very existence of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev dismissed it and said, well, don't think of me as Brezhnev. I never repress people's opinions. I'm all for pluralism. So in the end, Yeltsin pulled Russia out of the Soviet Union and pulled the rug from under Gorbachev, and Gorbachev remained the president without the country.
That's very interesting. And what do you think are the implications, therefore, for today? Because, of course, we're in a similar situation where many people are focused on the pressure that can be applied to Russia, and for obviously very good reasons. But do you think that, in a sense, the only way that this Russia changes is with a similar collapse from the centre, a shift in leadership? Do you think that Putin is a man who can be compelled by outside forces, or do you think that this is really going to have to be about the next generation to see a transformation in Russia's direction of travel?
This is really the key question. I do think that Putin is central to this story. That's his war. But the war already lasted for 3 years, and it became the war of much of the society, at least the society that lost people, families that lost their man in the battle, on both sides, by the way, on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. So it's clearly the longer the war lasts, the more difficult it is to end the conflict. And we know from the history of the Cold War that no one during decades of that conflict, much bigger conflict, knew how to exit. So there's no theory about how exit the conflict. There's only practice, like trial and error. But a few lessons from the Cold War, I think, are important for us to keep in mind. First of all, people tend to unlearn the past lessons in general. And I definitely feel like the current generation of European leaders, for instance, they learned more lessons of what suited their agenda. For instance, people from Eastern Europe, they focus on the lessons of appeasement in Munich and pre-1939 sort of Soviet occupation, 1940 occupation of the Baltic states. And they do not really dwell in any length on the lessons of the Cold War. And these lessons are important because during decades of the Cold War, we find several important things that animate the debate today, I think. First of all, the tendency to exaggerate stakes and expect falling dominoes. This falling dominoes is on the cover of my book, actually, for a good reason, because both sides during the Cold War were afraid to make even a small compromise. Well, especially Americans, I would say, they were just mortally afraid to make any compromise, particularly in the 50s, with the post-Stalin Soviet leadership, for fear that it would start falling dominoes and the entire Western order would collapse. And of course, there was a great exaggeration. And I'm seeing the same kind of thing today when they say, oh, Putin's Russia, if we make any compromise with Putin's Russia and Putin in particular, excuse their crimes and excuse their aggressions, that would be the end of the global liberal order. Listen, we're seeing this global order is under threat from quite another direction, much more than it was from the direction of Russia. So let's be serious, let's be realistic. A compromised end of the conflict will not topple the temple of the liberal order. The enemies are mostly inside. So exaggerated stakes is my number one lesson. Secondly, arms race is not a solution. Arms race make the roots of the conflict, the origins of the conflict, the causes of the conflict only continue. It's like kicking the can down the road. How many missiles, how many tanks, how many deterrents you have does not solve political questions. And sometimes during the Cold War, again, particularly in the 50s and before the Cuban Missile Crisis, diplomacy was a poor child, sort of pushed in the corner, and diplomats met, but it was assumed on both sides that diplomacy would not resolve anything. And yet we know that the most dangerous crisis in the history of humanity, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the Soviets sent Cuba, Khrushchev sent Cuba, and of course, Kennedy was very angry at him, and the generals suggested, let's bomb Cuba immediately to show that we stick to the principles, the Monroe Doctrine against Russian involvement and aggression. Fortunately, Kennedy decided to give Khrushchev time, and they interacted, not personally, not physically, but through interesting process of exchanging cables, exchanging messages, and it worked. So in part, I keep telling my students, we exist in this world because of direct interaction between the top leaders. And diplomacy is underestimated today to a great extent. Moreover, many commentators today say that diplomacy is dangerous, that Russians are, hockey players, as I heard today, or chess players as many times. They will outplay us. They will be hugely dangerous. Hey, how you want to resolve the conflict without diplomacy? Just by building more tanks, spending another $1 trillion? I totally disagree with this approach. And finally, the last, there are many lessons from the past, but we don't have enough time. A final lesson, I think it's a tunnel vision that we create for ourselves. And this is my first point. We are flooded by current information. This current information drives us into certain preconceived conclusions. Russia is dangerous. You cannot negotiate with the war criminal Putin. So you cannot resolve conflict by an armistice. You have to have armistice first and then negotiations second. All this is nonsense because during the Cold War, all of these dictums were not observed. And sometimes humanity was saved, as I said, because those principles were not observed. And leaders and their advisors were able to exit those tunnel visions and say, hey, after all, we need to survive somehow. Let's extemporize. Let's just think. So we have the Korean War lasted for 3 years, like the current conflict. And ultimately, in parallel, negotiations about the truce began. And everybody said, oh, well, it would be a conflict, just a way to stop killing, right? But we don't believe that it would resolve the roots of the conflict between communist North Korea and China and the Soviet Union and the West. Of course, it didn't resolve the conflict, but people stopped killing each other, and there's peace on the peninsula. Peace. The same thing was said about Bosnia later on in the 90s. That's beyond the scope of my book. It's about the Dayton agreements. Of course, negotiations will not resolve and it will be unstable peace, and all the sides may go back to war. People said it all the time in 1995, and yet we have peace in Bosnia to this end. So we have first to make things stabilize and prevent further killing, and then we shall see. That's my main lesson from the Cold War. We should prevent killing.
It's a very interesting take on events around that time and in the present context. I wonder, what would be your solution then to get the killing to stop? Because there are many who would argue that it is not in Russia's interest to stop the killing at the moment. Do you think they have to be surely compelled to stop, or do you think it is possible to persuade Putin to stop through diplomatic means?
Well, I said that Putin started this war, but he didn't get the war that he expected. And some people in the Russian army want to continue to fight, according to the latest New York Times article based on anonymous interviews. But the same people said, we are mortally tired. We don't want to continue this killing. So it's all about how to incentivize the top leader, Putin, to choose engagement with the peace process. And I think he already chosen this engagement. So let's say even he wants to continue to advance and get more Ukrainian territory, but he has to accept the language of peace. And this language of peace, this language of negotiations and truce creates its own momentum, its own dynamic. Yes, Russian society is subdued and people are afraid to speak out. But at the same time, millions of people listen on Russian media through Russian sources about Trump's peace initiative. And the very fact that Trump keeps saying, and this is reprinted in Russian media, that every week 5,000 Ukrainian and Russian men get killed. This is important. This is Vietnam War-like message American media sent to Americans, and that has consequences. So I think it must be some coercion to peace, but it cannot be through diktat and military means and arms race, because Putin is notoriously defiant to threats. He's a macho Rambo-like figure, stealing Rambo from American folklore, of course, and it would not work for him. But the language of peace may work. And most of all, the language that Trump uses, the language of the Mercury age. Let's cut deals, let's make money, let's replace killing with cutting deals and making money. I think that may affect the Russian elite much more decisively than anything.
One final question, if I may. When you reflect on the way in which nuclear weapons have seen a growth in recent years, in the context of your knowledge of the Cold War, does that concern you? Because there are some who argue that the more weapons that you have in individual countries, the more protected they are and you prevent conflicts. You know, if Ukraine had had a nuclear weapon, then maybe this invasion wouldn't have happened. So how do you reflect on the increasing importance of nuclear weapons in the modern age?
I don't believe that there's an increasing importance of nuclear weapons. All I'm seeing is decreasing importance of nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean we should ignore them. We can ignore their existence at our own peril. You know, of course, to be reminded, we do have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the entire life on Earth many times over. So it's important. But I don't think what people call the Second Cold War, which, by the way, I don't buy into this. The Second Cold War is not, but if you call it the Second Cold War, is not like the First Cold War. It's not the extension of the First Cold War, because now the main deterrent are not nuclear weapons, but economic losses, economic sanctions. And, you know, we may say that, of course, Western sanctions did not collapse the Russian economy, but they're very, very important for the Russian elite and leave Russia with pretty bleak prospects in the future. So engaging Russia on restoring economic connections with some payments, reparations, I don't know what, it's a matter of negotiations, but it's a huge deterrent and lure to the Russian elites and ultimately to the figure, whoever may come after Putin.
Well, Memphis has had to dash, so James, it's just you left for the final thoughts. Where do you want to leave our listeners today?
Thanks, Francis. I think I will just make the point that we saw in that meeting between Merz and Trump a moment where Mr. Merz got to put himself forward as a serious diplomatic player. And when I was getting ready to report on that meeting, I actually wrote a long piece where I spoke to sources in the CDU party before the Trump-Merz meeting took place to try and get their sense on how they thought it was going to go. And I had expected that they were going to be extremely nervous about it because of all of those tensions that we've talked about in this episode between Trump particularly and Germany. What I found when I spoke to these sources, and you can read the piece online, I think it's still quite revealing, even though the meeting has now happened, is that the Germans were incredibly bullish and were really confident that the meeting was going to go well. And as a journalist, I was slightly sceptical of this. I'd watched, like everyone else, the Oval Office meetings where world leaders basically got ambushed by Mr. Trump and his allies. And there was a part of me, as I wrote up the story, thinking, gosh, I hope these guys aren't in for a sort of massive letdown if they do end up getting completely monstered in the Oval Office by Trump. But the predictions from those sources that it was going to go well, of course, turned out to be accurately predicted that Mr. Merz was going to do surprisingly well in his meeting with Mr. Trump. And it boils down actually to personality. The sources that I spoke to pointed out that if you look at Mr. Merz's background, it's quite similar to Donald Trump's. Mr. Merz used to be a financial executive at BlackRock. He's got this kind of tough, macho business background. He's even got a little bit of a reputation in his party for being a bit too macho to the point of upsetting people. And the sources I spoke to said that's the key indicator of how he's going to get on with President Trump. We think that President Trump will respect that. We think that they will bond over that. And it does indeed seem to be the case that there's something to that. And perhaps that is why the Oval Office meeting went as well as it did.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.